Well, thank you very much. I'm going to be less optimistic than Craig, who's summarized tremendous work that's showing how to make a difference on the ground. And I want to try and answer a simple question, but a really important question, which is, will we slow global warming? And the answers are uneasy. If you ask the question, do we have global warming policy? Everywhere you look, there's evidence of global warming policy. You see it in global forums at the United Nations, in other places like in Davos. 8, 10, 12 major global conferences on climate policy happen every year nowadays. You see it in leaders of various flocks. The 1.2 billion person Catholic Church is led right now by someone who has put climate change and a variety of other things at the center of his leadership. Greta Thunberg, who's inspired many kids to skip school and protest climate change. As a teacher and a father, I'm not sure I entirely sign on to that program, but it's raised awareness about climate change issues. When you look for global warming policy, you see it in the actions of companies that have now committed to buy 100% of their electricity and other forms of energy from clean sources. Companies that you might say, well, there's rich companies that have high brand exposure, and so what they do doesn't necessarily matter very much. They're going to spend some money on a solar cell here and there and smile. But you're seeing it also in companies that are in the commodity business of energy, and in particular the big oil and gas companies that are in various ways investing in, for example, eliminating emissions of methane from the upstream. You will see over the next year or two those emissions go to essentially zero for all the Western companies, investing heavily in carbon capture and storage technologies that were mentioned over the last couple of days and so on. So when you look, you see the evidence of climate change policy everywhere except one place, which unfortunately is in the data. Emissions last year rose almost 3% per year. Ironically, as climate change policy has gathered steam in the form of international negotiations, you've seen emissions actually rise more rapidly. When you look at the atmosphere has not noticed a whiff. If you look, for example, at the Keeling curve, which is the longest continuous direct measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere atop Mauna Loa, the Keeling curve shows no evidence of all these policy discussions, of all these meetings at the United Nations and other places. And that's the problem that we're grappling with right now, which is that the climate change issue has been on the international agenda for about 30 years, a GPS. And we don't yet see evidence of it, of all that policy affecting underlying emissions patterns. Why is that? Fundamentally, that's because the main pollutants that cause climate change, of which carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, from deforestation that Jen Burney talked about, the main pollutants are well mixed in the global atmosphere. And so there's a disconnect between where they're emitted and where the ultimate effects are felt throughout the atmosphere. And that disconnect is reflected in the political interests at stake here, where there are costs for controlling emissions that are born in one place. They affect the pollution that then mixes throughout the global atmosphere and affects ultimately the state of the global climate. Understanding this underlying structural problem, this structural challenge to success, is crucial. It's very easy to be distracted by shiny objects or shiny orange objects that in various ways you might agree or disagree with the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. But when you look at the data, you don't actually see the Trump effect. In fact, you see a little bit of a rebound in terms of additional effort by states and cities and other places precisely because of who's in the White House. It does not erase the underlying structural problem here, which is the disconnection between the benefits that would come, significant benefits that would come from slowing global warming and the places that would bear those costs. We've learned a tremendous amount about those benefits. We know that there would be less flooding in South Asia, epic floods last year in Bangladesh in particular, epic floods the year before in Bangladesh in particular, and a variety of other places exposed. We know that many of those impacts are being felt already here in the United States. We have acute problems like an octopus in a parking garage in Miami. And you can imagine a world with less global warming that would have fewer of these kinds of impacts. And some of the impacts we're learning a lot about how to address. The octopus, you get a bucket, you put the octopus in the bucket, you take it back to the ocean, problem solved. But other impacts, much harder. Wildfires in California bankrupted the single largest cause for the bankruptcy of PG&E in Northern California. And frankly, the CEOs of the other two utilities in California are saying, there but for the grace of God go I, because these kinds of problems are existential now. You're seeing this in terms of the impact on human health. And when you look at the out years, the potential impacts on human health from pollution and interacting effects that Josh spoke about earlier, and ultimately from death, those are going to be the dominant impacts. The problem is that the benefits from controlling those impacts are still abstract and for the most part far in the future and disconnected from the places that are bearing the costs. And there are some places that are beginning to do things that are emblematic of the costs that would be paid. This is a new nuclear plant, two new nuclear plants going up in Georgia at a cost of between $9 and $25 billion, much more expensive than alternatives, but zero emissions. Here is the world's largest solar plant going up now outside Bakersfield, California, consuming desert and farmland at a cost of $2.5 billion, nearly 600 megawatts of power, also more expensive than the alternatives. So to me, what's interesting is that the antidote to the conversation we had at lunchtime about the difficulty of getting consensus, the antidote to that is that some places are willing to lead. Some places are going out and spending their own money on problems that are generating global benefits. And to solve the climate problem, we have to understand their behavior better. This is Earth Week, and here on the University of California campuses, we have a big contest underway where people nominate different kinds of activities. Here's the latest tally of all the activities that are going on in the UC system and the emissions that they've reduced. 13.5 million pounds of carbon dioxide have been saved. That sounds like a huge number. That number is 6 seconds of global emissions. This is the core challenge in addressing this problem, which is that the places that are inspired to lead the most on the climate change problem are almost intrinsically places that are a tiny fraction of the total problem. And so the game to be played here is a leadership game. It's almost an evangelical game. Everything we do to control emissions, we need to judge against the question of whether our leadership is generating followership. And that is true especially at the global level, where when you add up the emissions of the planet and you divide them by the interests of countries, no more than 1/4 of the world's emissions come from countries that are green countries, if you like, countries that are willing to spend their own money to address a global problem. And ironically, the more they do to control their emissions, the less relevant they become to the global problem. And so the more important it becomes to think about this as a leadership problem that is generating followership. And so I urge all of you in your companies, at home, in your governments, to evaluate your progress, not so much about whether it makes you feel good, but about whether it raises the odds of followership. Will we slow global warming? I'm optimistic about that over the long term. Over the long term is a long time. And in the interim, a lot of CO2 and other gases will build up in the atmosphere. We are in for a lot of warming. We need to improve our capacity to manage that warming. And you're also going to see increasingly on the agenda discussions of geoengineering. We touched on it briefly at lunch today. This is the idea that we would intervene directly into the climate system to try and offset some of the impacts. It sounds crazy, it sounds Dr. Strangelove. It is an indication of just how far we've let the problem go that we now need to take some of these ideas seriously. Thank you very much.